My name is Debbie New, and I coordinate the Vermont Community Thermal Networks. We've recently changed our name for Vermont Community Geothermal Alliance to better reflect the work that we're doing on thermal energy networks, and we'll get into that in a little bit. I'm here with Jim Dumont and some legislators to talk with you about H.669 and H.252, the Thermal Energy Network Act, and where that is in the session at this point. So because this bill is in large part about getting thermal energy networks into Vermont communities, it'd be great if you would share your name in the chat and where you're calling from, if you're calling from Vermont. If you are a business or an organization that's interested, you could put that information in there as well, because it's about municipalities, but it's also about many other entities that could implement thermal energy networks. So after the session, we will share the recording and the links that we'll put in the chat as we go through the information. And Jim and I are going to stay on beyond the half an hour because we imagine we won't get to everyone's questions. So we are here for the full hour if you can stay. If you have questions as we go through the information, please put them in the chat and then stay as long as you can. And we look forward to talking with you about the bills. So essentially, the Vermont Thermal Energy Networks Act is a green light for Vermont communities. It's a pretty simple bill. It authorizes municipalities and other entities in Vermont to implement thermal energy networks. Now, a lot of people are familiar with geothermal for heating and cooling a building, or even network geothermal that involves several buildings. But our Vermont bill follows other existing policies that are already passed or being filed right now that are using the term thermal energy networks. So for more information on thermal energy networks, you can see our website. We've got a bunch of fact sheets there, as well as a couple of videos. But for today, I want to share with you an illustration, which is conceptual. It's not technical or very exact, but an idea of what a thermal energy network could look like in a Vermont town. So first, notice underneath the park and the gazebo, there's a geothermal bore field. And that is where vertical pipes go down underground to about the depth of a water well, where the temperature in Vermont, we are estimating, is about 50 degrees year-round, constantly. And those vertical pipes bring the energy up into buildings where there are ground source heat pumps or heat exchangers that can provide heating, cooling, domestic hot water, and the system as a whole can provide thermal storage, really importantly, and a diversity of thermal energy resources, because not all thermal energy networks require geothermal components, and not all thermal energy networks are geothermal projects. We're also talking about waste heat and wastewater. So first, wastewater. You can see the blue line underground and the water that is leaving buildings. We heat up a lot of water and flush it down the drain every day. So there's heat that we can recover from wastewater, either from the sewer lines or at wastewater treatment plants. And those can be a really important part of thermal energy networks. There's also a lot of heat from industrial processes and from large buildings, grocery stores that are trying to cool things down and have to reject heat, or are creating heat in order to make cheese, for example, or beer or that kind of thing. So that heat, currently, most of it is being vented through fans on the tops of buildings, cooling towers, and it can be captured right there and repurposed and sent back into the building itself or sent to other buildings. So a thermal energy network looks more like what's happening in the second illustration, where that heat isn't wasted, but the thermal energy network is accessing those temperatures, and for the most part, they're moderate temperatures, right? The underground heat that we talked about through a geothermal bore field is about 50 degrees. The water that's leaving our buildings can be 70, it can be even closer to 100 degrees or above, but they're moderate temperatures. And the network, the water in the pipes, moves that temperature to where it's needed. So this is called technically a hydronic system. It involves mainly water in pipes, not high heat and not steam, which is part of why it's such an efficient system. So among the many benefits, oh, hang on a second. Among the many benefits that I've been asked to highlight today are cost savings and emissions reductions and the equity components of these systems. So Very briefly, once installed, a thermal energy network requires no fuel to buy or import from out of state, as we do with a lot of our thermal energy that we get today. Also, there are low operational costs. So these systems are relatively low maintenance, and the customer bills can also be relatively low, especially using the utility model that this bill will allow, that we'll talk about soon. The other thing about these systems is that they are high efficiency. That in itself provides cost savings because of the electric benefits, or the benefits to the electric grid. These systems shave electric peaks, and so they can lower our customer bills for electricity by shaving those peaks, but also can lower the build out of the electric grid itself and that expense. There's a recent Department of Energy report that goes into a lot of detail on this and the benefits of ground source heat pump or thermal energy network systems, and we'll put that link in the chat. We also have a 2-pager that is easier to read, or shorter to read at least, that summarizes a lot of that information. The other thing that thermal energy networks do is dramatically reduce our emissions from buildings. Decarbonizing the building sector is really tough, and these systems can help us go a long way toward reducing emissions from our buildings, even up to 80% or more of cutting back on emissions, because we're not burning anything to heat and cool our buildings. We also can provide cooling to our buildings with these systems. Any emissions are from the electricity that's used to run the pumps. And because these pumps are highly efficient, they use less electricity than other thermal solutions. The last thing I want to highlight is the equity of these systems. So number one, they're community scale. They're not house by house decisions that people make depending on what they can afford or access, but they can be available to many people in a neighborhood across a town to connect. So they're community scale. They also offer quality jobs to current fossil fuel workers and others. So whether people work on a gas system or deliver oil or propane, they're plumbers and pipe fitters, and their skills can be easily transferred to work on thermal energy networks. So that's some of the information that we have on this. There's more on our website. Please check it out. Please send me your questions. I'll put my email in the chat at the end of the presentation. But for now, we're going to focus on policy, and I'm going to turn it over to Jim.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. We have a couple of Vermont bills that in large part are based on Senate Bill S.4.922 that was passed unanimously by the New York State Senate about 1.5 years ago after it passed the New York State House. The fact that it passed unanimously is important because probably nothing else could pass unanimously in the New York State Senate, which is highly partisan. It was supported by utilities, labor, environment, and climate leaders. So Debbie and I sat down together 1.5 years, 2 years ago and came up with an early version of what's now H.242, H.669, and S.252. The bills that are in the legislative hopper right now differ from the New York Act in some important respects that are important for Vermont. One is the New York Act required the 7 largest utilities, gas utilities, and the 7 largest electric utilities to engage in pilot projects for thermal energy networks. The Vermont bill does not require any utility to do anything. The Vermont bill authorizes them to do so. It's up to them whether they want to do it. The Vermont bill requires the PUC to start doing rulemaking, so there's a structure to regulate thermal energy network utilities. But again, it's voluntary whether any of the utilities want to get into this business. The other major difference is that the Vermont bill authorizes municipalities to become thermal energy network utilities. And it does so without requiring them to go through the PUC approval process that other utilities would have to go through. The idea behind this is that Vermont municipalities already have sewer departments and water departments. They're accountable to their local elected officials, and the technology we're talking about here is very similar to municipal sewer and water. And as Debbie, I think we'll talk more about later, gathering waste heat from municipal wastewater treatment plants is a really important part of this. So it makes sense to have municipalities involved. So what we realized is that municipalities in Vermont can't do this for the most part because their charters aren't broad enough to include thermal energy networks. And rather than have 250 or 251 charter changes, we put this into the bill so that there is no charter change that's needed. By statute, every Vermont municipality would have the authority to get into the thermal energy network business, and they would do it without PUC oversight. A utility, as any other utility would, is subject to PUC oversight as to rates and quality of service. And we're saying to, if this passes, we're saying to municipalities, go forward and do what you do for sewer and water, but now you can do it with thermal energy. And these are the three bills which we can distinguish later if people have questions about it.
So these slides just reiterate what Jim was saying about the utility model, but also about how municipalities are treated separately in the bill. And Jim, do you want to say a few words about the other state bills or other states doing this work?
Yeah, we have some more detailed information. You can contact us for more of the details. There are 5 other states actually where it's been passed. I don't know which one's missing from this list. It's proposed elsewhere. The most advanced process is in New York, where the New York PUC, New York Public Service Commission, has a rulemaking case that's open. Every major utility in the state is involved with it. The Sierra Club, NRDC, and others are involved. It's a very thoughtful process, but it's much more complicated in New York than it would have to be here. So if people want more details, please contact us and we'll get into the details with you.
Great, thank you. So now I want to focus on the House bill and then we'll talk about the Senate bill. So Jim mentioned that H.242 was filed last session. Now we have H.669, which makes the major change of treating municipalities differently than other utilities. That was filed this year. And so H.669 is the House bill that we're looking at now. It's in the House Energy and Environment Committee. There are multiple sponsors for it. And it's also a priority of the Climate Solutions Caucus. And I wonder if Representative Dara Torre is here and if you want to unmute and you could tell us a bit more about the status of the bill in the House.
Happy to. Thank you, Debbie. It's in great shape in the sense that we have gotten the attention of our chair in committee. And we were even on the agenda last week, as you know, and hoping to get through the renewable energy standard this week. That's really been the big focus of our energy attention right now. And this is such an important complement to that. Such an amazing opportunity to make real improvements in reducing building emissions. And its timing optimal as we look at, creating more housing in the right places in Vermont, and, have hopefully future neighborhoods coming online. And it's very exciting to see the addition of the municipality piece to this bill. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about what's going on in some of our municipalities now. So for me, I'm very hopeful that we're going to have the bandwidth to take this up this session in the House.
Great, thank you for your leadership and also saying more about why it matters to you. Is there anything you wanted to add about your district or anything?
Yeah, I mean, my personal experience, I actually have geothermal in my home and it's low temperature water that's working amazing. It wasn't easy to do in a single residence. It makes a whole lot more sense to go at this in a group way. And I'm hoping that my district will be successful in adding more density in the right places in our communities, and that this would be hopefully a cost-effective, legal thing for folks to pursue. And I think it's very exciting to be among the first 25% of states really getting serious about this.
That's great. Thank you. I really appreciate your time joining us today to talk about it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And in the Senate, just filed was S.252, which is essentially the same bill as H.669. It's in the Senate Natural Resources Committee. It is sponsored and lead by Senator Chris Bray, and you can see the other sponsors, many from his committee, the Senate Natural Resources Committee. And I wonder if Senator Ann Watson is here with us today. If you could come off mute, we could talk about where it is in your committee.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So we were able to take up S.252, a couple, was it last week, or maybe a couple weeks ago, sort of losing track. But we did the walkthrough of it, and when we went through our list of priorities as a committee, this was among them. So I am very hopeful that we'll, again, all similar to Representative Tory's sentiment, that we'll be able to take it up this session. From the last I heard from Senator Bray was that it might be a couple weeks before we take it up again, because we're doing some Act 250 stuff right now. But I think, yeah, I'm very hopeful that we'll get to it this session.
That's really great news. And it's exciting to have it moving on both sides in both of the committees, the House and the Senate. Is there anything that you want to add from your own experience, or why you want to lead on this bill, or why it matters to you?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I think as much as we can be moving towards non-combustible heating sources, that is a high value for me personally, but I think, as a society, like that's the direction we need to be going. And so this calls attention to that, empowers it, enables it. And so I'm looking forward to more non-combusting sources of heat being used in Vermont.
That's great. And as a community scale solution, hopefully this can scale more quickly than individual homes.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for your leadership on this and for your time joining us today. Is there anything that you would recommend that people do in particular to help support you and the senators here, or what people can do?
Sure. Well, I think it is worth, especially for folks that live in the districts of people on the Natural Resources and Energy Committee, just being in touch to continue to encourage us that this ought to be a priority, and so that it's in at the front of people's minds rather than the back of people's minds. We know we have to do Act 250 stuff, but this needs to be high up on the list as well.
Great, thank you. It's good to know from your perspective what is effective to do. So
Yes.
at the end of the session, we do have a link to share to some actions people can take with the list of all the sponsors. So we'll help people know who to be in touch with and what to say. So
Thanks.
thank you very much for joining us.
Of course.
Great. And just before we get to questions, I want to make this more tangible to everybody here and talk about the conversations that are already underway in some Vermont towns and why this bill matters to some particular locations where people are talking about actual buildings and real solutions. So here's one Vermont town that is looking at 3 opportunities. One is in the downtown, where a hotel is being totally redone. Essentially gut renovation, new build, and there are businesses nearby in that same block who are very interested in sharing heat. So there's an opportunity downtown as part of their revitalization effort. There's also a wastewater treatment plant that can harness the heat that they have right there to use in the plant itself to lower the fossil fuels needed in that system. So that's an on-site thermal solution in that town. There's also an ice arena right next to their high school. So the ice arena is rejecting a lot of heat that could be sent next door to the high school. There's lots of room for a geothermal bore field, etc. So they're looking at 3 possibilities there, and they're watching this bill because this bill will help them be able to implement it. In another place, there's a hotel and a grocery store that local people are focused on because they are across a parking lot from each other. So the hotel has wastewater, the grocery store has waste heat, and the parking lot could be a geothermal bore field and paved back over so it can be returned to be a parking lot. So that would be one place to start. Nearby, there's also housing, there's a recreation center, and there's another larger grocery store that could become part of the network over time. Also in this community, there's an industrial park that is the location of their wastewater treatment plant, which is a source of heat. And there are also food and beverage facilities and other large buildings and businesses there, new businesses looking to move in that could produce heat, that could consume heat, and could share heat in a network in that part of town as well. And a third example is from a community that has a municipal building project underway, like probably many of you in your towns through MERP assessments, et cetera, are looking at renovating and reducing emissions from your municipal buildings. That's true here as well, with a new affordable housing development going in across the street as part of a downtown revitalization program there. And they also have a geothermal system that is almost complete going into a large nearby building. So there's a lot of opportunities in this town as well. So those are examples of the reasons why many of us are supporting this bill. And I just want to end this section by saying that we all know that heat is a precious resource here in Vermont. We have a lot of the heat we need. We're already making it and paying for it, and we have opportunities to harness it. And that, as Regional Planning Commission people have pointed out to me, thermal solutions can be local and actionable. So there's stuff that we can do. And to talk about this, I'm wondering if Representative Esme Cole is here, if you want to come off mute for just a minute and tell us about your district, if you made it to the call today.
Yes. Hi, Debbie. Thank you so much for putting this together. It really paints the picture so clearly as to why geothermal would be in all of our favors in Vermont towns. And I'm from Hartford. I represent that district, but I'm also the vice chair of the Energy Commission, newly elected there. So I've been privileged to be a part of these behind the scenes discussions with our energy committee, that as soon as we heard about geothermal, we saw the benefits and said, I think we might be poised and in a pretty good decision to actually take this on right away. And I think at this point, the only thing really holding us back is that it's illegal. And so, one of the reasons Hartford is in a great position to take this up is that we are in a rebuilding phase in our downtown area. For example, we have a courthouse that is, ready for reconstruction. We have stakeholders in our town who own quite a significant portion of the downtown district, who we've met, at table discussions. Like, Debbie's been a part of a lot of these discussions as well. And he is on board, which is pretty exciting. So local stakeholders with a lot of power, being on board, and, just like Debbie said, the fact that this is not a partisan bill necessarily is kind of huge. And I think we should take full advantage of the fact that, we have so much agreement. We see that it just makes a whole lot of sense. And yeah, so we took a tour with Debbie and with other folks who are on the technology side of things, of how we would actually implement this. A group called Shark Technologies, who is able to convert water heat from water sources to energy, and works very well with the geothermal technological process. So we gave them a tour of the courthouse and of our wastewater plant in Hartford. The ice rink and the wastewater plant in Hartford. And these spots were pivotal, I think, in part because we, in 2022, had a study conducted to identify which were the largest emitters of carbon in our district, emitted by our municipality and our municipal buildings. And it turned out that our wastewater treatment plant was the biggest emitter of carbon. And so usually there's not a direct cause and effect solution when it comes to policy, but this is kind of interesting that actually this could be a way to really draw down our emissions directly from the source. And I think the last thing I'll say too is that energy policy, when done right, can be equity policy. And I see this as a really good way to, support our most vulnerable Vermonters, especially when it comes to the cost of heating our homes and who tends to miss out the most when costs are high. And so I see this as a really healthy way for the planet and for the distribution of costs to manage our waste.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing what's happening in Hartford. That's really inspiring. And it's also great when a legislator like you can get involved on the ground level with these local efforts. So thank you for that. And also thanks for your leadership at the State House. So I guess it would be great now to try to get to some questions in the last couple of minutes. And as I mentioned, Jim and I can stay on past the half an hour to make sure that your questions are answered or that we hear from you. What I'd like to do is focus on questions about the bills first, rather than the thermal energy network systems themselves. So we are not collecting questions from the chat. We're just making sure that questions are logged there. So if you would like to raise your hand and ask a question about the bill, we'd love to hear from you. Earl, go ahead.
Yeah, I have read the bills. I just and very much support them. I just want to encourage our legislators to get to them in this session. Because we have the res bill coming out, and I know that that's a priority, and I would like to see this House and Senate bills on this come out also, because we're really wanting community solar and community thermal and geothermal together, and this community thermal is really important for our communities here in Vermont. And like Debbie's saying, so many communities are really wanting this and are already working on this. And I'm honored to have Representative Cole in our region in Hartford behind this, and here with us today also, and the other senator and representative that's here. So I just want to encourage them to keep up the work and try to get this out in this session if at all possible. And I appreciate that they're working on that. I just wanted to be a voice to back that up. Willie, thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for mentioning community solar, because solar pairs so well with these systems, and we can actually
Yes.
thermal energy off of solar panels and reject thermal energy onto solar panels to help them be more efficient. So we can use solar thermal as part of these networks as well. So they really go hand in hand. Jim, you've worked on the res bill. Do you want to say anything about how this complements it? Or any thoughts about the electric?
Sure. The res bill is really complicated, and this is relatively simple. And as people talking about this adds an equity part of the package. So whether it's Act 250 bill or the res bill, I hope the two committees are able to put that behind them and then look at this, spend a day or two on it, and pass it. One of the things Debbie mentioned, I think, is that this is the efficiency. In general, I mean, this has been studied by experts, and ground source heat pump is about 5 times more efficient than an air source heat pump. So in terms of reducing our electric demand from whatever source, thermal energy networks are really effective.
Thank you. And I'm going to call on a couple more people, but first, Ellie is my colleague, and I wonder if, Ellie, you could put the action link in the chat. We have a really simple Google document that has the list of sponsors and a brief suggestion of what you can do to encourage your legislators to support the bill. And also, there's a way that you can sign up to stay in the loop, not just about the bills, but also about thermal energy networks in general. So I want to make sure we get that information before people have to start dropping off. But as I said, we're here answering questions. So Jean, go ahead.
I'm wondering what, if any, resistance you're hearing or questions that are being raised, maybe even myths about thermal networks that we all need to know about in communicating with our legislators.
Thank you. Jim, do you want to take that one?
Well, one thing that is worth emphasizing is that these are closed loop systems. The geothermal does not extract water from underground. It simply uses the heat from underground and captures it in closed loop systems. I think that's come up a number of times. That's the principal myth that I've run into.
And I would add that these, as I said in the introduction, if you missed it, these are moderate temperature systems, not high heat, and they use mainly water in pipes. In some places, some glycol is added. It's food grade glycol. So the systems are really very safe. So I wanted to
In
emphasize
answer to Jean's question, something else does occur to me. There was a huge study done in Canada that addressed whether ground source heat pumps are effective at cold temperatures. And this study found that they're very effective. I know people have concerns about air source heat pumps, but the study found that ground source heat pumps were very effective even in the coldest Canadian winters. And whatever backup systems were available haven't been used.
Thanks. BB, your question?
Hi. I just wondered if you could speak to utilities, whether it's the gas or Burlington Electric or any others that may have had input or comments or support for this.
Jim?
What's their perspective?
Jim, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Debbie has been pounding the pavement, meeting with everybody on the planet about this. And one of the comments she got back from the general manager of Burlington Electric is that this bill is a no-brainer. There are no losers with this bill. They're only winners. And that was his sense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We've also talked with VIPSA and Velco and the department and the PUC and many others. So it seems like for utilities that want to take this up, they're not required to do it, as Jim mentioned, but for existing utilities that want to include this in their businesses, they're in support of this bill. It's an opportunity for them. Susanna and Jeff.
Hi, I was just wondering, you mentioned some instances of towns that have 3 or 4 conditions that would favor consideration of thermal energy networks. But if a town doesn't have a hotel that's being remodeled and a skating rink and a housing project going in across from a grocery store, does this have to just be on the back burner, or can we do something to kind of raise a level of interest or possibilities?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, if you talk with engineers about thermal energy networks and these systems, and you ask them about anything, they tend to say it depends, because these systems are so site specific. They are designed for the actual buildings, for the actual heating and cooling loads. So it's possible there's something in your town that could be a beginning, even if it's just a single large building like a town hall, a library, that could be that geothermal would really help in terms of reducing emissions there and over time save costs for the municipality. And there could be a way for that to be designed in order to connect to anything that's built nearby or any other buildings that might want to connect in the future. So that's why I've been talking with many in Vermont towns, and I will put my email in the chat and you can be in touch with me. You can talk about where you are and what's possible. I recently heard from someone from Middlesex, which I don't think of as necessarily a very dense community, but it turns out when we look at maps of what's where, that there are some possibilities there. So I'd be happy to talk with you about your location. And I think the other thing is that this is going to benefit our state overall in terms of reaching our climate goals and doing that equitably and making this accessible to as many communities as possible. So thank you very much for your question. And I'm just checking to see, okay, Joe, nice to see you.
Hi there. Joe, Northfield Energy Committee. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of put it out in the meeting as someone who owns a house in the village of Northfield. I'm very interested in this technology for me and my neighbors. I'm also on the local energy committee in town, as you know, Debbie, because we recently spoke. But I was just wondering if you could kind of speak on what would be some good first steps for kind of approaching the town and the community to get one of these projects started? Yeah.
I appreciate your question very much, because part of what I'm trying to do with many others is trying to help us all see heat differently. We experience it. We know it's helpful in the winter. We know we spend a lot of time and money on making it. But once you start looking for where there is thermal energy around you, it's hard not to see it anymore. I think I kind of drive my family crazy when we drive around and we pass a larger building and I'm looking for the cooling towers and the fans and saying, there's heat there, there's heat. And it's just wasting. So I think that general information for people about thermal energy that we have locally and how it can be repurposed, how it can be harnessed and moved around our communities is really helpful. We have on our website a very simple starter toolkit. We call it a getting started resource, and it has essentially fact sheets and videos that you can share with a group of people that you collect in your community. And then it has 6 questions. And for each question, there's an accompanying action, such as, where's there thermal energy in your community? And then it gives you ideas of the kinds of buildings and facilities to look for. And then we use a rule of thumb, a 1/4 of a mile distance between a place that's producing heat and a place that could use it. It's not exact. It always depends, as I mentioned, engineers say that. But if you're looking within a 1/4 of a mile, you might have a pretty good idea of what might be possible. So this toolkit walks people through some really basic steps, and it's meant to be user friendly, and it would be something that could be very grassroots, like is happening in some Vermont towns, where people want to take up this idea and they've gathered the people who are interested and they're meeting regularly to look at these things and they're making progress. Does that answer your question?
That's great. That's a good way to start talk with people and getting them excited.
Yeah, and educating them. And Ellie put the link to our Getting Started resource in the chat. And with that, we have a Google form where you can report what you find, and then we can have a conversation. So I hope you'll take a look at that.
Thank you.
Great. Ken, I think you're next.
Okay, my question is about the ownership or the installation of a network system. Would that be installed by a utility, or would it be, like a cooperative type ownership of several buildings together? And it would require pumps, electricity to pump the fluid around through the pipes, for the heating to keep it circulating all the time. So that would be an expense, anyway. Is
Yeah.
that included in the bill?
Jim, do you want to answer that part?
Yes, great question. Yes, it is included in the bill. If it's not a municipality, for example, if it's the Debbie New Thermal Energy Network utility, then Debbie would have a CPG from the PUC, and then it would be just like Vermont Gas or Green Mountain Power. They would have the ability to use public streets and, if necessary, eminent domain to connect the various private properties. The private homeowners would be in a relationship of a ratepayer to the utility. On the other hand, if it's a municipality that's doing it, it would be just like your sewer and water department. The town already owns the streets and the sidewalks and the ground underneath them, has the right to put pipes underneath it. So it'd be a little easier if it's a municipality rather than the Debbie New Thermal Energy Network utility. But either way, the bill does address that.
Great, thanks a lot.
Yeah, there are lots of ways to own and operate these systems, and that's part of what we're in conversation with Vermont towns about, is for what works locally. That's
And
another one, but it depends.
while we're on that, the simplest way to do it, it doesn't need the bill, and that is, say, if you're a college campus and you're investing the money for a thermal energy network and you're using all the heat on the land that you own, then you could do that right now. But this is trying to go beyond that.
Yeah. Great.
So at this point, I think I would go to questions in the chat. And I'm not sure this was the first one, but Keith asked about South Burlington City Hall, which has ground source, or as some people call it, geothermal heating and cooling. And are we collecting data? I hope South Burlington is. I trust they are, and I will ask the South Burlington people that I interact with. But that's not a Vermont Community Thermal Network's function. We do need data. There's not enough data out there. There's a very large $5 million data project going on in Massachusetts around their pilot projects that I hope will help us here, but we also need Vermont and Vermont scale data on these systems. So thank you for the question. I'll ask South Burlington. And then there was a question about system designers, engineers, et cetera in Vermont who know how to design these questions. Thank you, Linda. And the answer is yes. Most of them are designing just the bore field or geothermal loop systems in most places. In some cases, as at Champlain College, those are interconnected or networked. But I would say that we are talking to Vermont Technical College about training more engineers in this and increasing the workforce in terms of designers who are doing this work, because we do want to scale this here. We would like to use Vermont designers, engineers, and all of that. There are people nationally who are offering those services, and we can call on them as needed. And I would also add that we want these systems to be well designed. And so I think for the first projects we do in Vermont, it would behoove us to do peer review and have national experts who are working on these systems, designing these systems in other places, weigh in with Vermont people who are working on these as well. We're also working on developing the ground source heat pump workforce in Vermont, which includes drillers and also installers, plumbers, pipe fitters. We're talking to a lot of different people and tech centers, career centers, about making sure we have the workers that we need. And that goes across the clean energy spectrum. That's a big effort in our state. So we're trying to make sure that ground source heat pump systems are part of that conversation. Go ahead and raise your hand if you have questions. I'm going to scan through the chat and make sure you raise your hand if I miss your question. I think there was some comment. There was a comment about Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and are they involved? And we've had a couple of conversations with them. They're a wonderful resource, and we'd like to keep talking with them more. And thanks for that suggestion about their funding resources. The question about what's a CPG came up. Is there more to explain about that, or more people want to know about that? Because that's a key component of the utility model.
Jean had a question about MERP funds.
Okay. Question is, can MERP funds and regional planning commissions be of help in assessing thermal energy networks in a town? Yes, I'm talking with a number of regional planning commission people, and they're talking with towns in their regions about MERP assessments. In many cases, MERP assessments are a lot about energy efficiency and weatherization, and that's really important for any kind of clean energy system, obviously, that we put in our buildings. Some MERP assessments are including looking for geothermal or ground source heat pump opportunities. So that the regional planning commissions have been great in terms of making sure that that is included in the list of things that people are looking for. So the MERP funds, for people who are not familiar with it, it's Municipal Energy Resilience Program Plan. I'm not sure what the P exactly stands for. But this is about assessing municipal buildings for weatherization and clean energy improvements and emissions reductions from buildings. So a lot of those MERP funds are going to go toward building improvements, but that will certainly pave the way for bringing in thermal energy networks in the future. And maybe there'll be some geothermal town halls as a result of it, hopefully. Henry asked, will there be IRA funding for 10? Yes, there is IRA funding for 10. The thermal energy networks are eligible for 30% IRA tax credits. So that means that a business can get 30% off of a thermal energy network. There's an additional 10% or up to 10% bonus for domestic manufacture of the components. So that's why we say 30 to 40% tax credits through the IRA are available for these systems. the IRA regulations or the guidelines on the domestic component aspect of this have yet to be finalized. So we're watching that very carefully. There are other bonuses that the industry is following nationally, and we're submitting comment letters to try to help the IRS do the right thing and support this clean energy solution through tax credits. So, but right now, part of what makes these systems a no-brainer is 30 to 40% off these systems. And also municipalities get something called direct pay or elective pay, which means that because they don't have a tax burden, they get a check from the IRS for that money. So they get that as cash from the IRS. And in Vermont, we're working with the Vermont Bond Bank and with Vermont Economic Development Authority, or VEDA, because those entities put together financing stacks that can include the IRA incentives and can also include any kind of financing needed in order to get to those incentives and to make up the difference. So there are lots of different ways that these systems can be financed locally, and the IRA is a huge part of it. It's an amazing opportunity for us now. Any thoughts or questions about the IRA? It's complicated. We're learning more about it. Everybody is trying to learn more about what it all means. Okay, so then Paul asks, is there anything in the bill that encourages the buildings to participate in adding insulation to their buildings to reduce their loads and make their geothermal supply a greater percentage of their heat load? Jim, do you want to answer that one?
Listening to some of the experts that Debbie has assembled, I've learned that a part of what the engineers do is answer that question. In their design for the project, they will, that's like the first thing on their list is how can we make this building more efficient, and then where do we put in the heat pumps?
And there's nothing in the bill that encourages that, or the bill is just about implementing thermal energy networks. Esme, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm wondering, is there a list of resources that are available to help towns with feasibility studies and the cost of doing a feasibility study? Like, I know the IRA perhaps could help with that, but maybe some other sources too.
I don't have that information. That's part of what I'm working on with
Sure.
people in Vermont. That's a really important need. One thing I want to say about feasibility studies is that it's easy to jump to a feasibility study and that can mean investing a lot of money in an idea that ends up not happening. So it's really important that feasibility studies aren't among the first things that happen, but that we have a conversation about the opportunities local, and we bring in engineering experts to look at the buildings, look at the heating loads, and decide when a feasibility study is worth spending the money on. So that's what I would say about that, and also that it's a huge focus of our work to figure out how to make that affordable for towns. Thanks for asking that.
Thank you.
And Linda asks, is direct pay on the tax credit available for this technology for towns? Yes, that is a main function of direct pay, is to support municipalities in doing this work. So that means that they get the money directly as a check. And John asks, are there any benefits for weatherization or heat pumps or thermal energy improvements for nonprofit organizations since they do not pay taxes? So for thermal energy networks, nonprofits are the same as municipalities in terms of being eligible for direct pay. So that's the same benefit for a nonprofit organization as for a town. I don't know about weatherization and other kinds of heat pumps. Great. Well, I want to thank you all for coming and for staying so long. Thank you for listening, and also for being in touch with your legislators to support these bills. I'm optimistic, and I know it's going to take some more work and some and your participation in this is really important. So maybe we could put the link to the action page in the chat again, and a link about how you can sign up to stay informed about what's happening. And I will continue to stay on, but I just want to say thank you again. I really appreciate all of you, and it gives me energy to keep doing what I'm doing and what I'm doing with a lot of other people. So thank you. And Kim, do you have a question or thought?
So, several people mentioned there's an equity component, and I can guess that this reduces costs for people. But is there something I'm not immediately thinking of in terms of equity for this kind of system?
Well, there's the cost reduction, but there's also the community scale nature of it, which I mentioned earlier. So I don't want to repeat something that doesn't answer your question. But because it's not just me deciding or Jim deciding or you deciding to put this in your house because you understand it, you know someone who can help, you can afford it, potentially. It's something that people can hook up to. It can be available in affordable housing developments. So it is accessible and affordable to more people by
Great.
taking it to the community scale. But thanks for asking, because that is a really important part of why many of us are advocating for this.
I'll add a little bit, which is we wrote the bill so that you could have the thermal energy network equivalent of community solar. You could form a nonprofit and a community could design and operate their own system. And it could be a low-income housing community, could be a mobile home park, it could be a residential neighborhood.
Yeah, and my friend Sarah Griffith writes in the chat, thank you for helping, Sarah. Another aspect of this is that the monthly charge can not only be low, but it's going to be predictable and stable rather than like oil and propane and even gas prices. So, Jean, go ahead.
An example of a situation that might answer the equity or address the equity question is that in the town of Bethel, between the firehouse and the local school building, there is a trailer park where with a number of lower income residents. So we have there is that if the town were to put a network in to provide for the firehouse and the school, there is the possibility that those trailers might be included in that network.
Yeah, thanks for that example. I don't know about trailers and ground source heat pumps and how that all works, but that's a really important question. I've been wondering about that for a while. But you're right that putting in a network, even if it's a small one to start, means there's a potential to expand it. And as we look at our towns, putting the people who need the clean energy, the affordable energy the most, putting them first in terms of where the network goes is a really key site selection criteria for us. Thank you again to the legislators who came. It's really great having you here. Thanks for hanging on with us. Keep working together.